Hi, I'm Devon. Welcome to West B. We are excited about our upcoming Day for Hope. On July the 30th, we'll be hosting local businesses and agencies to bless 100 kids and their families that just need a little extra help. We also have the opportunity to share the gospel with them. What a great way to love on our community. But we need your help. Would you please join us on Saturday, July the 30th? Connect with Grace Gogan at the Welcome Desk this Sunday or visit hope.westb.org. Our epic road trip VBS is almost here. Have you saved your seat yet? You won't want to miss out on this epic journey. It all begins June the 20th through the 24th from 6 to 8:30 p.m. All completed VPK through 5th graders are invited. Don't leave your friends behind. Invite them and go to fortheneighborhood.com/kids to register your kids or register to help. Well, that's it for now. Let's worship together.
What is a godly man? And what is biblical manhood? We're not going to be able to answer that question comprehensively in one sermon, of course. But we are going to be looking at a man named Job. And we're going to see his life and how he was able to work through suffering, unfortunately, as a man of God. So what is a godly man? The answer is really clouded by three extreme views in our culture. And I do believe that these are extreme views, even though that they may seem like they're becoming more mainstream or more popular. There's this caricature. The first one that I'll say is there's this caricature of manhood where it is exaggerated. And you get this over-the-top machismo characteristics, and that's what a real man is. I mean, you kind of think Rambo, and I know that's a fictional character, and it's meant to be fictional, but there's many who would look to that kind of man and say, well, that's a real man. So that's one extreme view. But there's another extreme view that makes men out to be more cartoonish, where manhood is silly, where men are buffoons. And, you can see this particular view in a character, another fictional character I know, Homer Simpson. But then there's one that I think that is rising in popularity that frankly is a bit scary, and that's the cast-off man, where manhood is not needed. We don't need men to be, quote-unquote, real men. Well, none of those views are biblical, and frankly, none of them are helpful. The Bible has a completely different answer. Society needs godly men. Our homes need godly husbands and fathers. Our church needs godly men to rise up and to lead and to do what God has called them to do. Well, what does that look like? Job is one example of a godly man in the Bible. And if you look at Job chapter 1, verse 1, we see that he is blameless. There once was a man named Job who lived in the land of Uz. He was blameless, a man of complete integrity. He feared God and stayed away from evil. A man of complete integrity, blameless. This is a good start to understanding what biblical manhood is. Job is a great start. In chapter 1, you see how he offers burnt offerings for his children, and it was his regular practice to pray for his kids. If you look at chapter 29, there's a lot about who he is in chapter 29 of Job. Verse 11 talks about how the community respected him. And then it continues in verse 12 of Job 29, where Job helped the poor. He took care of orphans and widows and those who were without hope, it says. In Job 29:14, we learn that Job was honest In Job 29:17, we see how it says, Job says, he broke the jaws of godless oppressors and plucked their victims from their teeth. It's a great verse there. Continues in Job 29:21. Everyone listened to Job's advice. They wanted to hear from him. This is a good man, a godly man, a man that was well respected, and a man that honored who God was. He had integrity. He was a family man. He had a strong sense of justice, and he served those who were in need. Job was honest and thoughtful, but he was also willing to throw down if oppressors tried to take advantage of those without power. This is a great example of a godly man. So, happy Father's Day. We're looking at Job on Father's Day, which may seem a little strange at first, but it's really not. Because for all of you dads that are out there, for all of you men that are out there, Job is a good example of how to live. So he was honorable. He was honest. He had integrity. And how did God reward this incredible man? He rewarded him with suffering. Okay, where is God in suffering? Where is God in the pain? And where is God when you belly flop and it just hurts? We're going to be answering those questions here on Father's Day as we look at the life of Job. So we're in a series, God's story from beginning to end, and we're just walking through sections of the Bible and connecting all of the dots to all the stories in the Bible. And it's really not a collection of stories. The Bible is one story. It is God's story, and it all points to who Jesus is. So Job is part of the books of poetry. It's part of the books of wisdom literature. We've included it in this section on prophecy just because of the way the series kind of worked through. But it does have that feel of prophecy, even if it's not a prophetic book. Now, the story is an old one. In fact, many believe Job to be one of the oldest stories in the Bible. We don't know who wrote the story, but it is about a man of integrity who suffers. And one of the key questions that is offered in the book of Job, if not fully, it's not really fully answered, but it's there, that if God is good, then why do people suffer? So let's go to the end of Job, and let's look at the end of the story. So I invite you to make your way to Job chapter 42. We're going to look at the first 6 verses in Job 42. Then Job replied to the Lord, I know that you can do anything, and no one can stop you. You asked, who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorance? It is I. And I was talking about things I knew nothing about, things far too wonderful for me. You said, listen, and I will speak. I have some questions for you, and you must answer them. I had only heard about you before, but now I have seen you with my own eyes. I take back everything I said, and I sit in dust and ashes to show my repentance. So here Job says, God, I've heard rumors about you, but now I've experienced who you really are. It's one thing to study God. It's one thing to hear about him. It's a completely different thing to have a direct encounter with God. I've personally, maybe you have too, I've heard of Newton's law of universal gravitation. I've heard of Einstein's general theory of relativity. I'm not a scientist. I would not even pretend to be one. I don't know enough. So I've heard of those things, but I really got to know gravity when I slipped down my front steps the other day. Thought I'd broken my wrist. I didn't. I was kind of a baby about it. But, you can talk about these great theories, and you can know a lot about them, but it's a whole nother thing to experience gravity. Does gravity exist? Yes. Can you see it? No. Do I need to know what Newton and Einstein taught to get the point of gravity? Not really. I can just fall down the steps and I can know all about it. Does God exist? Yes, he does. Do you need to know every single theological proof explained to get to the point to where you know that God exists? No, you don't. You just need to experience him. Job didn't understand every single theological point about God. We don't either. But he got to know God personally through suffering. And through Job, we learn how suffering draws us near to God. Many people will say, I want an encounter with God. And what they really mean by that is, I want a positive spiritual experience that makes me feel good. That's what they mean. Some churches build their ministry around that principle. Like, let's feel good about ourselves and feel good about God. This is a faulty way of ministering. It's a faulty way of thinking. It's a faulty way of worshiping because of something very obvious: suffering. Suffering. How does suffering draw us close to God? And how does God use suffering? And as we talk about manhood and what a biblical man is, well, what does this all have to do with Job? Well, Job was an upright man, a good and devout man, a God-loving, a God-fearing person. And then Satan wants to attack him because he has integrity, and God allows it. So if you read the first couple of chapters, you see these two attacks from Satan. The first attack is Satan takes Job's wealth, and then Satan kills Job's children. It's a horrible, horrible thing that happens. All of Job's capital is wiped out. His wealth, his cattle, his sheep, his camels, they're all gone. And even worse, his children are now gone too. They suffered demise in a house collapse. It's a very tragic story, the way that it begins. And Job's response is one of the richest theological lessons in life. And we find this in Job chapter 1, verses 20 through 22. This is after he loses everything. Job stood up and tore his robe in grief. Then he shaved his head and fell to the ground to worship. He said, "I came naked from my mother's womb, and I will be naked when I leave. The Lord gave me what I had, and the Lord has taken it away. Praise the name of the Lord." In all of this, Job did not sin by blaming God. This is a reasonable response. We are born with nothing. Nothing goes with us when we die. Everything in life is on loan from God. It comes to us from God. Every good thing that you have ultimately comes from God. But then we get Satan's second attack in chapter 2. And he takes Job's health. He becomes terribly sick. And Job's wife and Job's friends kind of enter into the story to offer him advice. His wife really doesn't give him very good advice at all. In fact, she says in chapter 2, verse 9, his wife said to him, "Are you still trying to maintain your integrity? Curse God and die." And then his three friends enter into the scene in verse 11. They start offering their advice. And in essence, their advice, as we find at the end of chapter 2 and then throughout many chapters in the middle of Job, what his friends basically say is, "Well, Job, this must be your fault." So Job's wife, she says, "Okay, just hate God. Just be done with it." And then his friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, they tell Job, "We need to hate yourself." Well, hating God or hating yourself, these are not very good options. And then from chapter 3 all the way to chapter 32, you get this back and forth between Job and his friends, and it is quite dramatic. Job is claiming innocence during this time while these three friends try to assign blame to him and figure out who's to blame. Now, what does Job do? He cries. He screams. He curses. If you look at the beginning of chapter 3, verses 2 and 3, it says, "I cursed the day I was born, and when they said, 'It's a boy.' I cursed when I was conceived." He's lamenting all of that has happened to him. You get really two themes here, throughout these chapters in the middle of Job. I'm innocent, that's the first thing, and Job says that over and over again. And then the second thing is, I'm cut off from God. If only I knew where to find God, Job says. We see this gut-wrenching speech in chapter 23. Then Job spoke again. "My complaint today is still a bitter one, and I try hard not to groan aloud. If only I knew where to find God, I would go to his court. I would lay out my case and present my arguments. Finally, in chapter 38, Job hears from God. God speaks, but it's in a whirlwind. Now, here's the hard part of what God says in chapter 38. God doesn't offer an explanation, nor does God even really offer much comfort. God presses into Job. Who are you, Job? And then who am I? Let's look at verse 38. We'll look at part of it. Look at verses 4 through 7. Where were you when I laid this is God speaking. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me, if you know so much, who determined its dimensions and stretched out the surveying line? What supports its foundations, and who laid its cornerstone, as the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy? All right, let's skip over to verse 31 now. Again, God speaking. Can you direct the movement of the stars, binding the cluster of the Pleiades, or loosening the cords of Orion? Can you direct the constellation through the seasons, or guide the bear with her cubs across the heavens? Do you know the laws of the universe? Can you use them to regulate the earth? Can you shout to the clouds and make it rain? Can you make lightning appear and cause it to strike as you direct? Who gives intuition to the heart and instinct to the mind? Who is wise enough to count all the clouds? Who can tilt the water jars of heaven when the parched ground is dry and the soil has hardened into clods? This chapter, this kind of stuff goes on for like 3 more chapters. And Job, chapter 40, he tries to answer. So, this is God speaking. Who are you, Job? And who am I? And Job briefly attempts a response in chapter 40, verse 3. Then Job replied to the Lord, I am nothing. How could I ever find the answers? I will cover my mouth with my hand. I've said too much already. I have nothing more to say. Fine, I'll shut up. And then God speaks again. We see him speak in chapter 40, verse 6. Then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind. Brace yourself like a man, because I have some questions for you, and you must answer them. Will you discredit my justice and condemn me just to prove you are right? God continues, and we see here who God really is. And are you as strong as God? Can you thunder with a voice like that? All right, put your glory and splendor, your honor and majesty, give vent to your anger. Let it overflow against the proud. Humiliate the proud with a glance. Walk on the wicked where they stand. Bury them in the dust. Imprison them in the world of the dead. Then I would praise you, for your own strength would serve you. Only I determine justice is what God is saying there. And God is asking Job, are you more reasonable than me? And the answer is no. Back to the end where we began, in Job chapter 42, verses 1 through 6. Remember what Job said there? He's satisfied. He's content. And he repents, it says there at the end. He sits down in dust and ashes and shows his repentance. And then God turns to Job's 3 friends at the end in verse 7 of chapter 42. After the Lord had finished speaking to Job, he said to Eliphaz the Temanite, I am angry with you and your 2 friends, for you have not spoken accurately about me, as my servant Job has. So God gets angry at these friends. Okay, what's the lesson here? You get all this back and forth. You get this dramatic scene. You get a man who has integrity suffering, and then friends trying to explain why he is to blame. What's the lesson here? Here's the lesson. While we are not consistent, God is always consistent. Job's story includes the struggle of good and evil, because good and evil exist. The patterns of good and evil actually help to prove the existence of God. The fact that God's created world has order means the same things that can bring life also can bring death. Think of water to drink. You need water every day to live. But if you inhale water, if you inhale enough, you will drown. You need fire for warmth. You need some sort of, if you live in a cold climate, you need some sort of warm source. Well, that's like fire. It can bring life. But if you jump into the fire, that brings death. The same thing that brings life can also bring death. And without this order that God has set into place, life would be chaotic. It would be totally unpredictable to the point of not knowing what is true or untrue. Think of another example. Think of a hammer. A hammer is a tool. You use it to nail nails into some sort of source, usually wood. And a hammer is solid. That's what gets the job done. But a hammer can also be used as a weapon. It's not just a tool, it's a weapon. But what if God said, ooh, that's not a good thing. That hammer is needed because we need to be able to nail stuff into wood to build things. But then somebody might use it as a hammer. And what if God said, well, okay, every time someone tries to use this hammer for murder, it'll just turn soft and they won't be able to do it. Well, if that happened, we wouldn't really know what it is. If everything just was always changing, we wouldn't understand it. In the same way, we couldn't know a good God without consistent patterns of good and evil. God stands out. He stands out against evil because he's completely defeated evil. And what we learn through these patterns, where something that is a tool can also be used for evil, what we learn actually is that God is in control. He's sovereign. He's all powerful. God is all loving. Job realizes in chapter 42, as the book ends, he realizes that God is in control. He can't sit in judgment against God. That's how he responds. Okay, I can't sit in judgment against God. And Job also realizes he'll never understand everything, and he's okay with that. That's what chapter 42 is about. What's more difficult in suffering? What's more difficult? And I say this in all love because I know some of you may be suffering. What's more difficult in suffering? To believe in God or not to believe in God? I think believing in God is far better. Because if there's no God, then why are you complaining? If there's no God, then suffering has absolutely no meaning. I think of a common scientific theory, one that's controversial, the idea of natural selection, survival of the fittest. This particular theory is a brutal theory because in natural selection, pain is useless and you have a senseless existence. Pain means nothing in the world of natural selection. Darwin explained it. One large group slowly conquering another large group. And for evolution, life is random, life is purposeless, and evolution actually depends upon suffering. Evolution depends upon evil. And within evolution, at least in the sense of survival of the fittest, violence is natural. So if you are a non-believer in God, you say there is no God, well, then you have no reason to feel any outrage about injustice, any kind of injustice, any kind of pain, any kind of suffering. Your response, if you don't believe in God, should just be, well, this is the natural order. It is simply survival of the fittest. You see, without God, suffering still exists. It's still there. But it becomes a tool for bettering yourself, for surviving where others can't. It puts you in a place of exacting the same suffering on others as you are trying to avoid yourself. Now, there's a better way. There's a truth out there that's a better truth. Job's wife told him, hey, just curse God and die. And in essence, what she is saying there is survival of the fittest. Move out of the way and let the rest of us have your stuff, Job. That's what she's saying. Job's story reveals ultimately how Satan is defeated through suffering. How did all this begin? Chapter 1, Satan says to God, Job only wants your blessing. That's why he's a man of integrity. That's why he worships you. It's because you've blessed him. You've blessed him with material goods. That's all he wants. Well, how does it all end? After all of this suffering, what does God say of Job in chapter 42? And there's some tough exchanges between God and Job. What does God say of Job in chapter 42? 4 times he says, my servant Job, 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 right there at the end of the book. Job was God's servant through whom evil is defeated. God used Job to defeat evil. If you knew evil could be defeated, but that you would have to suffer first, would you still do it? And for many of us, I believe that is your calling. I believe you would do that. See, evil can be defeated, but you're going to have to suffer. Are you willing to do that? I think most of you would say, yeah, I am. Now, the book does end with Job getting everything back. Obviously not his kids, but his wealth. Job chapter 42, verse 10 says, when Job prayed for his friends, the Lord restored his fortunes. In fact, the Lord gave him twice as much as before. Here's the thing. That's a wonderful part of the story, but even if the story didn't end that way, it was still worth it for Job to suffer. Even if he didn't get all the camels back, it was still worth it. Even if he didn't live to 140 years, as it says, it's still worth it. But there's something even deeper here. And it's Job's real problem. Why did God press into Job so hard? Why did God not offer comfort and an explanation? I mean, Job's the one who said, I'm the innocent sufferer. Job's the one who said, I'm the one who's cut off. God replied to him, no. There is only one sufferer who is completely innocent. There's only one sufferer who is completely cut off. Job is ultimately pointing us to the cross. The cross shows us how the greatest evil can be used for the greatest good. The problem that is brought forth in Job is the problem of theodicy, the problem of good and evil, often called theodicy. Why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? It's a question so many people have asked. I like R.C. Sproul's answer. Why do bad things happen to good people? That only happened once, and he volunteered. Here's one thing the cross shows us. God is not indifferent. God is not detached. And God loves you. He does not hate you, he loves you. And Jesus' love is so perfect that he willingly took on the greatest evil for your greatest good.